I recently had the chance to go fly fishing with a complete beginner. She did great and even caught some fish, but like every beginner, she made some mistakes too. I was there to help her fix those problems, but a lot of beginners are doing this all on their own. They don't have a guide or even an experienced fishing buddy to help. Some of the mistakes this beginner made were basic, but I realized I haven't spent nearly enough time addressing these problems here on Untangled. On today's show, I'm going to go into detail on the biggest beginner fly fishing mistakes and how to fix them so that you can increase your chances of putting fish in the net, even if you're figuring this out all on your own. This is Untangled, fly fishing for everyone, presented by Ventures Fly Company. Hey everybody, welcome to it. This is Untangled and I am your host, Spencer Durant. On today's show, we are going to dive into 4 of the most common beginner fly fishing mistakes and how to fix them. Before we get into each of those mistakes in detail, just a little bit of background of how this came about. A few weeks ago, Alex and I took my mother-in-law fly fishing. She's the beginning angler that I mentioned in the hook to this show. We actually put her through the VFC crash course because she had never picked up a fly rod before. She'd seen them because I lived with my in-laws for a little bit, but that was the exposure that she had to fly fishing. Was her son-in-law is a fly fisher. And we put her through the crash course. She actually got into some fish. She did really well. We filmed the whole thing. It's on YouTube. I'll throw a link in the show notes if you're interested in checking that video out. But the 5 or 6 hours that I spent acting as the guide, I was the guide all day for her. I walked her through everything and got her into some fish. But the time that I spent on the water with her really brought to light the 4 major mistakes that we're going to talk about today that hold beginning anglers back from being as successful as they could be. Now, we could sit here and I could make more mother-in-law jokes than I know what to do with on this show. And I probably will take advantage of that opportunity because anybody who knows me knows I like to crack a joke every now and then. But want it right out of the way at the beginning. I love my mother-in-law. She's fantastic. I was stoked to have her come out and do this with me and Alex. But any jokes I'm making her, I'm not throwing her under the bus at all. So I want that on the record before we get into things too much. But the mistakes that my mother-in-law made, that I was there to help her correct while we were on the water together, I realized that a lot of those mistakes are ones that I have not given enough time to here at Untangled. And those are the 4 that we're going to go over today. I'm sure there's more, and I'm sure we're going to revisit this topic in the future, but these are the 4 that stood out to me. So the first mistake that I believe beginners need to focus on is the fact that when you're out fly fishing, you need to figure out how to be able to pay attention to multiple things at once. And the mistake that the beginners make, in my mind, is that they don't practice enough before they go out on the water. Now, my mother-in-law, her name's Laura. So again, great lady, not a knock on her at all. But she told me that one of the biggest struggles she faced while we were on the water together was concentrating on doing so many different things at once. Specifically, she gave me the example of how overwhelming it felt to think about making the right cast, getting the casting rhythm down. Then you have to transition. You've laid your cast down. Then you've got to transition immediately to stripping line in, and you've got to strip that line in at a correct speed, right? We're on the water. The line's coming back at you. You have to bring that line in at the right speed so that you don't have too much slack, but you're not causing drag. That's not a skill that comes naturally. Which shouldn't be any surprise. A lot of the stuff in fly fishing are skills that don't come naturally. It's stuff we have to learn. Well, all of that and managing her line as well without making her dry fly move, because she was fishing a dry dropper rig, that whole group of issues proved overwhelming. And to me, what that told me was we should have probably spent more time practicing the casting before, because casting is the one thing that you can practice before you go fishing, and even when you're not able to fish, you can practice your casting, and that is going to dramatically help you improve. because you don't need a river to practice it. All the other stuff, stripping line in, mending, you really do need the water there because you're going to get some surface tension on your fly line that's going to make everything feel and act differently than if you're just casting it out on the grass. But spending that time to practice your cast before you get out on the water is going to give you one less thing to think about. Because casting, at the end of the day, it eventually becomes muscle memory. Managing your line on the water is going to become muscle memory as well. But being able to commit that to muscle memory takes time. And if you can take just one of those processes off your plate, it's going to reduce how many different things you have to pay attention to while you're out there on the water. So, again, I can't stress this enough. Practice your casting. It's going to help out. I promise. This is going to make a huge difference in how successful you are while you're on the water. Pay attention to how you let the line slide through your hand during the cast, and then how quickly you can transition from letting the line slide through your hand during the cast to stripping line in as if you were fishing a real drift. When we make our cast, we've got our rod in our rod hand, we've got our line in our line hand, and we're letting some of that fly line go through our line hand, correct? And then once you've laid your cast down, you are going to pinch a little bit of the fly line against the cork of the rod with your rod hand, and you're going to strip line in that way. That way you've always got the ability to go tight and put tension on your line, set the hook effectively if a fish takes your fly. Always remember that your hand shouldn't ever leave the area of the cork grip. Again, your rod hand holds the cork, your line hand stays right next to it and strips in line. If you're reaching up above the cork to pull line during the strip, you are opening yourselves up to tons of slack and a lot of potential for missing and losing fish. So in addition to practicing your casting, I want you to also pay attention to how you transition your hands to stripping line in after you've made your final cast. If you can commit, all right, I've got the cast down to muscle memory, and I know my hand goes here. I never reach above the cork to pull slack line. I just pull it all right there at my hands. I never move my hands from above or below the cork, because if you do that, again, you're introducing way too much slack into the system, and your potential for losing fish increases dramatically. Now, go find a park or your driveway or a little used side street or an alley or something. Just go find somewhere that's big and open and practice. Get your casting rhythm down so that you do not have to think about it while you are out on the water. When casting, and then that process of moving your hand to start stripping line in, when those two things become muscle memory, you don't have to think about that while you're on the water. It just happens. It's going to free up space to focus on the other skills that you can't really practice anywhere but the water, like mending or managing your fly line or watching for bad drift or drag. All those other things that you've got to pay attention to, you can suddenly give your entire focus because you're not worried about the cast being perfect or about how you're managing your line. So again, I can't stress it enough. Go out there, practice, and it is going to make a huge difference in the success you have out on the water. So that's tip number one. Mistake number two that beginners make that they can easily fix is beginners have a tendency to move through water a little bit too quickly. They throw a few casts out, they don't catch a fish, and they're ready to move on. On Laura's first cast, she had a fish eat the nymph on her dry dropper rig, but she didn't see it because she was trying to sort her line out after the cast. Like I just mentioned, that's another reason you want to practice. But after that fish, Laura had to spend another hour before she got another fish. Now, she landed the next one that actually ate her fly, but in between the first fish and the one she actually put in the net, she would look at me every couple of drifts and say, okay, same spot, or do I keep going? And I was continually having her thoroughly cover every piece of water because, and I'll get into this in some detail, but you've got to do that. If you want to start to learn and understand how to read water, you've really got to cover the water thoroughly when you're out there fishing it. Now, after Laura caught her first fish, she asked to see how me and Alex approach the water. So Alex and I took turns fishing, and the comment that she made was something like, "Well, that was so fast. How do you guys catch them so quickly?" Well, that's a really good question. But what it comes down to is that Alex and I know how to read water because between the two of us, we've been fly fishing for, I think it's more than 40 years. We're old. So I'm getting gray hair now. I got a haircut the other day, and I looked at how much gray was in there and realized my life was over. Oh, it wasn't quite that bad, but it was scary. Anyways, we've been doing this a long time, Alex and I have. So we can identify the places where trout are most likely to hang out, and we know how to quickly get a fly in front of them. But I made Laura thoroughly fish every piece of water because A, you never really know exactly where the fish are going to be. You can make a really good educated guess, and a lot of times you're correct, but you don't know for sure. And B, I wanted to teach that lesson of getting your flies into the strike zone quickly and letting them stay there as long as possible so that you can cover every piece of water that a fish might be hanging out in. The lesson here is a reminder that you need to thoroughly cover all the water you're fishing, because once you do that and you start to notice patterns, oh, I caught a fish here, I caught a fish here, I caught a fish here, you're covering every piece of water. You're teaching yourself the lessons that Alex and I have learned over the years, which is, oh, I see the tail of the pool is a wonderful place to fish. Well, let's just take that for an example. The head of a pool is really good. The middle, it can be a crapshoot sometimes. But the head and the tail, you got to focus there. So when we get to a pool, Alex and I immediately fish the tail first. We don't go right to the deepest part. We immediately go to the tail because we've got so many fish out of the tail of a pool, we know we need to start there. A beginner, however, might not know that. But by thoroughly fishing every piece of water, you start to recognize those patterns, they start to build, and you don't forget where those fish were. And that's exactly what I was trying to have my mother-in-law do as well. Now, the other thing to not forget here when we're talking about thoroughly covering all the water is that you need to make sure if you're fishing a dry dropper rig or a nymph rig that you're covering all the depth as well. You're not just putting the dry fly in every lane where a fish might be holding, but you're getting down deep enough to present the flies not only to the upper part of the water column, but the lower part as well. I mentioned we were fishing dry dropper rigs that day with Laura, and the creek isn't all that deep. So we had a little bit of a longer dropper with a bigger nymph, so we had the water column covered. We had the bottom and the top. I think at the deepest, the creek was maybe 3 feet. Not a very deep river, and the fish were all in pretty shallow water as well. But we had that water column covered pretty well. Make sure you're doing that in your own fishing. Make sure you are paying attention to where your nymphs are drifting, how deep they're drifting, and you're adjusting that as needs be if you're not catching fish. The third mistake to watch out for revolves around hook sets. I actually underestimated how hard this was going to be. I used to guide, and I guided a lot of beginners when I was doing it, but I used to guide, how long ago was that? I don't even know. But I was guiding in Utah, and I took a lot of beginners out, and I don't remember teaching hook sets being as hard with my guiding business as it was with my mother-in-law. Now, again, I'm not throwing my mother-in-law under the bus here. That's what it sounds like, but I'm not doing that, I promise. The point being, I think I forgot a lot of the ways that I used to teach hook sets, and Laura actually missed a few fish because her hook set was either too slow, or it wasn't hard enough, or it was too hard. There's a delicate balance in setting the hook, especially when we're trout fishing. But the general thing to remember with your hook sets, and this is going to increase how many fish you hook, and if you're hooking more fish, you're going to end up with more fish in the net at the end of the day as well. So first thing you've got to remember with your hook sets is you got to keep the line during the hook set, make sure it's tight. Okay, keep that line tight. Ideally, by keeping some of the line pressed against the cork with a finger on your rod hand. This is something I talked about a few minutes ago, where during the casting portion of this, where you do want to make sure that you've always got some line in between a finger and the cork. Now, it doesn't need to be pressed tight against the cork. I've said this before, and I didn't communicate it very well. I always have some fly line running through my middle finger on my rod hand. Alex uses his pointer finger. It doesn't matter. Just one of those, because if you're pulling the line through that finger, and I leave a little bit of gap between the rod hand, the finger, and the cork, just enough for the line to get through. But if you do that, then when a fish takes, all you got to do is squeeze and lift, and you've got a tight line, which is what you need and what you want for a good hook set. So always, always, always keep the line tight during the hook set, ideally by keeping some of that line pressed against the cork with a finger on your rod hand. Second thing you've got to keep an eye on, you got to have very little slack between you and your flies while they drift. This is another area where Laura had a few problems because she had way too much slack in her drift, and I was trying to coach her through it. But again, it goes back to that problem of she had so many things to focus on that was overwhelming for her. Once we shortened up the cast she had to make and we got her into a different position, that's when she actually started catching fish because it reduced how much she had to think about. Again, make sure you go out and practice, because if you practice and these things become second nature, you don't have to worry about it. Kind of works out nicely. But anyways, make sure you don't have a giant pile of line on the water. There's no reason that you need half your reel out on the water. Just take off enough from your reel, enough fly line to make the drift, make the cast that you need, and no more than that. Too much more, and you're going to run into those problems of too much slack, or you're going to get tangled in the line, and you're going to trip and fall and fill your waders up, and you're going to be cold and miserable, and don't ask me how I know about that. All right, too much line on the water makes it tough to pick up slack and set the hook quickly, so avoid that as much as you can. Finally, the actual method of the hook set itself, what you want to do is lift straight up with your rod firmly. It needs to be a firm, relatively quick movement, but you don't want to jerk the rod. This isn't the Bassmaster Classic where we're doing Academy Award-winning hook sets. Set your feet and yank and twist your whole body. A good guide friend of mine, actually, we were fishing years ago on the Green River together, and this was shortly after, this was a long time ago, and this was shortly after I'd recommitted myself to only fly fishing. I grew up fishing a lot of jigs and spin fishing quite a bit, and did that for a lot of years, bait fished for a lot of years, fly fished off and on, but towards the end of high school, I committed myself to fly fishing only and going down that road. So this was shortly after that. And one comment this guide buddy of mine kept making, he was on the oars, I was in the front of the boat, and I'd set the hook, and I kept missing fish. I remember I missed 5 or 6 in a row, and finally I looked at him and said, "What am I doing wrong?" And he said, "Well, you're twisting your body. It's like you're doing a golf shot in reverse, like you're a golf swing in reverse. You're twisting your hips and pulling back when you set the hook, and you're actually pulling the fly line and the fly out of the fish's mouth." And then he made me sit on the oars and watch him for a minute, and his hook sets, his body didn't move at all. He literally would just lift the rod and keep the line tight, and boom, he didn't miss a single fish. So that lesson has stuck with me for a lot of years, and I hope it sticks with you because it really is important, right? You just need to lift straight up firmly and quickly. That firm, quick lift combined with a tight line that we just talked about will drive that hook point home. You're not going to have anything to worry about if you could pull that off. So remember that, and that's it for hook sets. Now, the fourth mistake that beginners make, the last one we're going to talk about today, is macro versus micro worries. This is an area where Laura actually impressed the heck out of me on this one. And it's one where I see a lot of beginners need to follow her lead. So y'all need to be a lot more like my mother-in-law. You can worry about your rig. You can spend time on the water worrying about your rig or your fly selection or whether your cast looks pretty enough or whether you're in perfect water. Or you can simply worry about the most basic fundamental in all of fly fishing, which is get your flies in front of a fish in a way that they look natural. Everything else is secondary. Were Laura's cast picture perfect? No, but she caught 5 fish, including the biggest brown of the day. Alex and I both got to fish after we were done filming, and Laura wanted to see what we could do, and she wanted to learn by watching a little bit. She asked us to fish, and we put a few fish in the net that way. But her fish that she caught, that brown, it was the first fish she caught. It was bigger than anything Alex and I caught by a wide margin. She was focused entirely on putting flies in front of fish instead of all the other stuff. And that mattered. That mattered a lot. All the other stuff, if your cast looks pretty, if you're in the exact right spot, if you have the exact right fly, all that other stuff matters, but it only matters if you're able to get a natural drift in front of a fish. Your cast could be award-winning, but it does not count for crap if you're spending all your time fretting over your rig or your knots being perfect or whatever because you're not actually fishing. And your cast could still be perfect and look beautiful, but it's not going to count for crap if you're not putting it in the right spot. If you're not putting your flies down naturally in front of a fish, if you're putting it in water where fish aren't even holding, that's a problem. And again, your cast doesn't count for crap at that point. Get your flies in front of fish and success will follow in some form. You're either going to be rejected, they might not like your dry fly, or you're going to catch a fish. Either way, you're going to learn something by getting your flies in front of fish. Don't worry about leader setups. Don't worry about tippet rings, knots, or anything like that. Learn to read the water, put your flies in the best spots, repeat and learn from the failures and the successes. That is how you're going to improve. And I think this tip, more than anything else, matters more than anything we talk about. I've talked about this concept on the show a lot lately, about your macro versus your micro worries. Put your flies in front of a fish. That's all that matters. Do it in a way that looks natural, and you are going to learn something, either because the fish are going to eat it or they're not. And either way, you've learned something. And if you pay attention to those lessons and you just focus on the basics, everything else is going to fall into place. Years ago, when I recommitted myself to fly fishing, I was on the Lower Provo River. I was with a buddy, and he was getting into fish left and right, just pulling fish out. Nice fish, big rainbows, big browns. And I was jealous as all get out. And I looked at his rig, and he had completely different flies on than what I was fishing. So I switched on my flies. And then I didn't catch any fish. So I looked at his rig again, and he had more split shot on than I did. So I put on more split shot. Didn't catch any fish. And then I looked at his indicator, and he had a different color indicator. So I switched the color of my indicator. Didn't catch any fish. My buddy was fishing a seam right off the main current and right on the edge of a pool. I was fishing in the rapids, not the riffles, the rapids. My flies weren't in front of fish. His were. I had the same rig, the same color indicator. The rigs carbon copy of each other, down to the color of the indicator. Didn't catch fish. Because my buddy was in the right spot. He was fishing the right water. He put his flies in front of fish. I didn't. And it took me longer than I would like to admit to learn that lesson and to realize that's why I didn't catch fish that day. I cannot stress the importance of this enough. Focus on getting your flies in front of fish, and the results are going to follow. I promise. All right, folks, that wraps up the opening portion of this week's show, but don't go anywhere. Grab a drink and get comfortable because the Q&A section is coming right up.
One of the most frequently asked questions we get from both beginners and experienced anglers is, what fly should I use? With the thousands of fly patterns that exist, it can be completely overwhelming. That's why we've put together an entire ebook that walks you through everything about bugs and picking the right fly, no matter where you're fishing. So if you want to level up your skills and start catching more fish, click or tap the link in the show notes to get this ebook for free. All right, back to the show.
If this is your first time here at Untangled, welcome to the greatest fly fishing podcast ever made. We spend half the show every week answering a few questions that we get direct from listeners and viewers just like you. There's a link to submit your questions in the show notes, and I'll either answer those questions during the Q&A section of the show, or sometimes they are the basis for the show's opening segment. First question this week comes to us. Dan from Missouri writes in. It says, "Hi, Spencer. I've really just started investing more time into fly fishing after being fly curious for the last couple of years. I've been listening to a lot of the podcasts and beginner masterclass to up my knowledge, and the work you're doing has been great in making me feel less overwhelmed. I've been mostly spending a few hours a week on local lakes, But yesterday was finally able to get to the river to really try to put some of this knowledge to work. While I got skunked, it was still a good session to work on drifting and amends, reading water, various rigs, etc. In reflection, 2 questions come to mind. What are some considerations when deciding how long to drift? I found myself typically quartering upstream 45 degrees in riffles and covering the water all the way downstream with the necessity to mend 4 or more times per drift. Would I be better off covering less water per drift and casting more frequently? And number 2, I found myself getting a lot of bird nests with multi-nymph rigs. Any tips or considerations in the cast I should be focusing on to minimize this? I think in part I had too thin of leader, 6X, so I will at least experiment here. Dan, great questions, and thank you. Congrats on getting out on the water. I'm sorry you got skunked, but happens to the best of us. Alex gets skunked on the regular. I never do. I always catch fish. I would never get skunked when we have all the cameras and we've hiked into some remote place to film something cool. I would never not catch a fish. Obviously, I'm kidding. Again, if you're new here, a little bit of sarcasm goes a long way here at Untangled. Dan, to answer your first question, it really just depends. And I know that's probably not helpful, but it's hard to give a definitive answer without being on the water with you. But you asked, is 4 mends too many per drift? Would you be better off making shorter casts and casting more frequently than 1 long drift? Well, here's the guidance I'm going to give just based on that question in general. Remember that one of the keys to success in fly fishing is working close to far. This means that you focus on the water that's closest to you first, fish it thoroughly before you move on to hitting water that requires a longer cast or even walk upstream or maybe a few mends to get the drift just right. You want to thoroughly fish all the stuff in front of you first so that if there's a fish there, you can catch it instead of spooking it away, which can then potentially spook other fish, and it's this domino effect where all the fish are just hiding because you scared one of them. Now, that's a little dramatic, but it can happen, especially on smaller water. Off the cuff, though, it sounds like you might be trying to fish too much water at once. That's just my impression after reading your question, but long drifts are really good. The fact that you're getting long drifts, that's fantastic. That's going to serve you well. That's a great skill to develop. So I wouldn't be upset that you're getting long drifts and you have to mend 4 times. That's perfect, to be completely honest. Mending 4 times per drift isn't a bad thing. There's no number of mends that, I mended too many times on this drift, so I guess I need to fix it. There's nothing like that. Again, go back to the basics like I just talked about. Get your fly in front of a fish, make it look natural. Do you need 4 mends to do it? Okay. Do you need 20? Okay. Make it happen, right? Keep things simple. Get your flies in front of fish, make it look natural. You're extending, with these long drifts, you're extending the time the flies are in the strike zone, and that's a great thing to do. Again, mending 4 times per drift is not a bad thing. There's plenty of days where I mend that much per drift, even on smaller water. The key, again, is making sure that you're fishing close to far. So focus on that, close to far, get those flies in the strike zone. All the other stuff doesn't really matter. Make sure the drift looks good. All right. Again, you might be trying to fish a little bit too much water, maybe break it up into smaller sections, but without seeing your river or being there with you, that's hard to say for sure. Now, to your second question, 6X leader is probably way too small. Unless you're on the frying pan or the South Platte. There we go. I can't believe I was blanking for a minute. Now, unless you're on something like that, or highly technical rivers with fish that have 8 PhDs each, 6X is a little overkill a lot of the times. I fish 4X leaders almost all the time. That's almost all I ever have on my reels. The only time I change that is if I'm fishing streamers, if I'm fishing a really big hopper dropper rig. In fact, the first time that I tied on 5X this summer was with Alex a few weeks ago. We were out fishing and filming, getting a little bit of work done. And I walked up to this pool and we could see a pretty nice fish rising. He was eating emergers just based off of how he was coming up. So I tied on some 5X because the water was very low, very clear. So I knew that 4X had a chance to line the fish. I had a chance to scare them a little bit. And in low, clear, slow water, thicker leader can actually cause a little bit of micro drag, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's drag that you can't see with your naked eye, but it's there. And a good indicator that you have micro drag is if a fish comes up to look at your fly and refuses it, even if it looked perfect to you. That's either an indication that the fly is a little too big or you have micro drag. So I opted to eliminate the micro drag at all and just tied on 5X and ended up catching. It was a beautiful fish. It was pretty big, fat, really colored up, wonderful fish. But definitely up your tippet size, Dan. I would go to 4X. Again, I don't know your fishery, though, so it's hard for me to tell you definitively what to do. But I would go to 4X. I think you're going to be just fine. The other problem, you mentioned this happening specifically with 2-nymph rigs. So that's what made me think of it. You're probably not waiting long enough during your cast, and you're tangling up during the cast. Remember, when you have 2 nymphs, a bobber, and some weight, you have a lot of weight on that cast. That means your line's not going to be moving as quickly, so it takes longer for that loop to open up on the back cast. You've also got more line on there, so it's going to take longer for your loop to open up on the back cast. If you move your rod forward too quickly before the line straightens out, you're going to tangle every single time. So slow down the cast, bump it up to 4X, and I bet you'll see a big difference in how many tangles you have. Thanks so much for sending that question in, Dan. I appreciate it. And let me know if you need clarification on any of those. Next up is Blake from the USA, writes in and says, I have a sort of longer question for you. Say I am fishing a double nymph rig under an indicator. What would be the better way to rig that specific setup? Should I tie a heavier weighted fly on the bottom as sort of a point fly and then a lighter fly on top? Would it be more beneficial to tie the heavier fly up top and the lighter fly below? I've looked into doing both and sort of have adopted the method of putting the heavier weighted fly as the point fly to allow my flies to get to depth fairly quick. Any tips would be greatly appreciated. Love the Ventures Flyco team. Keep up the good work. Hey, Blake, thank you. Appreciate you taking the time to send this in, and I appreciate that a lot. So, I really wish Alex was here because he could talk authoritatively on the nymphing aspect of it. I'll give it a whirl. I was taught to set up a nymph rig. It's the way that I still do it. The way that I was taught is to put the heaviest fly up top and the lightest fly on bottom. When we talk about point flies, for those who may not know, what we're talking about is the fly that drops to the bottom very quickly and is usually heavy and large, and then all the other flies in your rig are tied usually above that. When we talk about a point fly, it's usually going to be the bottom fly in a rig. That's usually what it's referring to. Anyways, I tie my heaviest fly up top and the lighter fly on bottom, and I tie them off the bend of the hook off of each other. So I've got a tandem nymph rig, and I don't use tags. Again, for those who may not know, another way to set up a nymph rig is you can tie a triple surgeon's knot or a blood knot, and you can leave the tag ends long, and then you can tie nymphs off the end of those tags as you put pieces of leader and tippet together. I've found that using tags results in more tangles for me, and I catch enough fish with the standard tandem nymph rig that I don't feel the need to change it up. Alex, on the other hand, fishes tags all the time. So there's definitely more than one way to do this, and he doesn't tangle up more or less than I do. He's used to fishing them. He's more he's just more in tune with how that rig works, so that's probably why he gets fewer tangles. I just don't do it. But again, there's more than one way to do this. I also know a few guides who put the heavy fly on the bottom. Again, they make it the point fly. They use it as the weight in the nymph rig, and then they tie the fly that they actually think will catch fish up above that. The idea being that the bigger fly in the rig is going to get the fish's attention, but they'll actually eat the smaller fly. They'll see both. They'll opt for the smaller fly. I have no clue if that's what happens or if that's what's going through the mind of a fish when they see the rig, but the guides I know who rig their rods this way are very successful. My 2 cents is that it doesn't matter. What matters way more is getting your nymphs into the strike zone, keeping them there, and doing that without any drag. If you can accomplish those three things, I don't think it matters how your nymph rig is set up. That's all you should be focused on with a nymph rig. If rig mattered so much, if the exact way and pattern that we put flies into the water mattered to the degree that you would significantly catch more fish with a certain setup, that's what we'd all do, right? But we don't. We all fish different ways because we all come up with different ways to most effectively get the flies into the strike zone, keep them there, and not have any drag. That's what we're focusing on. In some instances, I will tell you, Alex's tag system outfishes mine 10-1 because the way that rig's set up is it will sink a little bit quicker. So when we have smaller pockets to hit, that will usually end up getting down quicker. And that rig that Alex uses tends to be a bit more sensitive than mine sometimes, because if I've got to make my rig drop quickly, I've got to tie a lot of heavy flies on there. So I don't have nearly as much sensitivity in the rig. Whereas with the tag ends, you do have a bit more sensitivity sometimes, I think. So there's pros and cons to both. I think my rig, A, my rig's easier to set up, and B, I think it casts a little bit better than Alex's. So there's some trade-offs you're going to make no matter how you rig your flies up. But at the end of the day, we're both accomplishing the same thing. Getting our flies into the strike zone, keeping them there, doing that without any drag. That's what you need to be focused on with your nymph rig. You do that, you're going to catch fish. The rest, as they say, is just window dressing. Thomas from Massachusetts has our next question, writes in and says, I'm new to fly fishing and have found VFC to be a super helpful resource getting the hang of things. My question is about the health of the fish. I've heard to always wet your hands prior to handling a fish, use a rubber net, don't fish when the water is warm, or at least shorten the fight. I'm wondering if you could dive deeper into how to impact the fish as little as possible. Thanks, tight lines. Thomas, great question. Very timely as well, since we are just winding up another long, hot summer here in the Rockies. So I'm just going to go through some general fish handling best practices. This is the stuff that if you're going to fish for trout, you need to know. And I'm not coming at this from I'm better than you because I handle my fish better than you do sort of place. You see a lot of that crap in the Facebook groups where somebody will post a picture of a trout they caught and maybe they're squeezing it too hard, or maybe the trout's got dirt all over it. Okay, did that person make a mistake? Yeah, probably. They don't need to squeeze the fish as hard. They shouldn't have put it on the bank. But is it worth dragging them publicly over it? No, it's worth educating. Definitely, that's a chance to say, hey, fantastic fish, congrats. Next time you go catch trout, maybe keep X, Y, and Z in mind, because trout are fragile creatures. They're not making new trout water these days. We need to conserve and protect what we've got. And at the end of the day, we want to treat the fish as best we possibly can. That's why we do catch and release in the first place. Okay. I find it kind of funny that we're all so willing to do catch and release, but the minute that we start to talk about best handling practices, people, they raise their hackles a little bit and get defensive. We're not telling you that you're stupid or dumb or an idiot for making a mistake. We've all made mistakes. I've made mistakes. I've talked multiple times on this show about how I have killed a lot of fish because I didn't know how to handle them properly. I do now because people took the time to educate me. So that's where this is coming from. It's not coming from a place of condemnation. It's coming from a place of, hey, here's the best way to do it. This is going to help the fish the most. Do this stuff as much as you can. So bear that in mind as we go through it. Remember that trout are very temperature dependent. They don't feed much when the water hits that 68 Fahrenheit number. When it gets 68 degrees, they're not going to move as much when the water warms up either, because warmer water actually holds less dissolved oxygen than colder water, and less dissolved oxygen means the fish has to work harder to move around. So of course they're going to keep their movement to a minimum. If the water gets too warm, trout can actually die. That's why it's best practice to not fish if the water hits 68. You'll see places, there's plenty of places just here in Wyoming, here in Yellowstone, they've got hoot owl restrictions, which means you can't fish after 2 p.m. in the afternoon. You can fish from, I think, 6 a.m. to 2 in the afternoon. That's it, because the water gets too warm and you don't want to stress the trout. They'll still eat a little bit, but if you hook them and fight them when the water's that warm, the chances of them dying goes up exponentially. Always use a rubber net or a rubber coated net when you're out on the water. Trout actually have a protective slime layer that keeps them safe from disease. Cloth nets or our bare, dry hands even will strip that slime away and that can kill a fish. So get your hands wet before you touch the fish and use a rubber net so you're not removing that slime layer. In that same vein, when you do handle a fish, don't squeeze them. Gently hold them while you're getting the hook out. I've actually found that fish respond better to being gently held, where it feels like you have less control over them, versus if you're just trying to squeeze them real hard to get them to stop. I've found that when I squeeze the fish too much, that's when they get really squirmy. When you just hold them, they generally will cooperate and you get that hook out fairly quickly. Now, speaking of hooks, fish barbless, it's better for the fish. It's better for you. If you hook yourself, digging a barb out of your skin, I've had to do it more than once. It's not fun. A barbless hook hurts, but it goes out real easy. You don't have to do surgery to get the barbless hook out. Barbless is the way to go. It reduces handling time because the hook comes out quicker, and you are not going to lose more fish because you're fishing barbless. If you set the hook and fight the fish correctly, you're going to be fine. Finally, if you do decide to take a picture of your fish, it's fantastic. We all love fish pics here. Just make sure that you don't set the fish on the ground. Don't put it on the bank. Don't put it in the grass. Keep it in the water. Ideally, keep the fish wet the entire time. You could just lift it just a tiny bit out of the water, take the picture. But if you do want to take it all the way out of the water, just make sure you don't have it out for more than 5 seconds. Once you cross 5 seconds, the fish has an exponentially higher chance of dying. And again, we don't want that. So keep all this stuff in mind. Do your best. Take care of the fish. Have fun. I'm not telling you how to have fun. I'm telling you to have fun, though. So go out there, have some fun. Take care of the fish. Make sure you're doing your best to watch after them. And with that, folks, we're going to wrap up the Q&A section for this week. But show's not over yet. We've got the Live Real Life moment coming right up. This is the Live Real Life moment of the show. And each week here on Untangled, we share a story and either pictures or video from listeners and viewers who've been out living real life and catching fish. We want to hear your stories. We want to see your pictures. We want to see your videos. So there's a link in the show notes to submit your own Live Real Life moment. This week's Live Real Life moment is from Micah. Hey, Spencer. This is one of the brook trout I caught on a trip this June in central Pennsylvania. My father and I were working our way up the small creek as we approached a large hole. I told my dad we should stop and watch for any rising fish, doing as I have been taught from the Untangled podcast. Small mayflies were emerging and the brook trout were eating heavily. I fished the back end of the hole and caught a few smaller fish. Then my dad spotted a larger fish sitting along a ledge in the hole. I cast my dry dropper and the fish ate the nymph. As soon as I fought the fish, it tangled itself in some sticks, and in something short of a miracle, I landed the fish. The fish measured 11 inches, my biggest brook trout to date, a lasting memory I wanted to share for my Live Real Life moment. Micah, that's awesome. I love that story. And I love that you threw the line in, doing as I have been taught from the Untangled podcast. That's fantastic. That power of watching and waiting, though, really makes a difference, doesn't it? When you get up to a place, instead of just casting immediately, when you watch and wait and observe what's going on, you get a lot more information and you up your chances of success dramatically when you have more information, more knowledge to plan your attack. So that's fantastic. I love that story a bunch, Micah. And the picture you sent in was great. For those who are listening to the audio version, I'll put the picture in the show notes so you can look at it. And obviously for those watching on YouTube, we threw the picture up on the screen. This is a fantastic shot, Micah. Congrats again. Great job on the fish. And that's going to wrap it up for us this week, folks. Thank you so much for being with us the whole show this week. I really appreciate it. Thanks for the support on the show in general. It's fantastic. It's really cool to see how many folks are enjoying the heck out of the show and my meanderings behind the microphone here. If you've got a question that you would like answered on the show, there's always a link to submit those questions in the show notes, and as well as your Live Real Life moment. They're always going to be in the show notes. I want both of them from you. The show runs on questions. We can't do what we do without questions from listeners, so please send those on in. And if you haven't already, please rate and subscribe to us wherever you're listening or watching. That makes a huge difference in how many people we can reach with the show, how many anglers we can help to get out there and have a better day on the water. And speaking of having a better day on the water, I think it's time to go fishing. So get out on the water, go catch some fish, and until next week, everybody, live real life and tie lines.